few favors, so he agreed to take this topic. So Scott Flynn from Dow AgroSciences, Dr. Flynn has been with Dow AgroSciences for a number of years. He's doing an outstanding job, and I've asked him to come and address this topic of can I afford to spray for weeds in my pasture? Join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Flynn.
Well, I've got two mics on me. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I think one of them's probably recording me. But first of all, I want everybody to give Gary Lacefield a big round of applause for his organization of the Dow Symposium over the past few years. Gary has done an excellent job, and he has really been the creativity behind making this this symposium a big success, and so I personally want to thank Gary as well. So today I'm going to try to address an issue that tends to pop up a lot, and that's can I afford to spray my pasture for weeds? All right. I'm going to give you a little bit of foundation though before we get into the actual numbers, the nitty-gritty of estimating that that pasture weed threshold. First of all, I want to give you my pasture weed control philosophy. Folks, I can sell you a jug of herbicide any day of the week that will probably take care of any number of your weed problems. But the thing is that jug will never open a gate. That jug will never go out there and monitor your grass height. The thing is when we get into weed management in our pastures, it's an integrated approach between our grazing management, good soil fertility, the use of the herbicide, and even in some cases, it'll even be the mechanical control component. But the thing is when we combine all these tools together for a weed program, we should be shooting to get 2 to 3 years between a herbicide application. That means that with our good grazing management, with our good soil fertility, that our pasture should stay vigorous enough over a period of time that at the very least we should be getting 2 to 3 years between that application, and that's going to extend that dollar out. Now, when you're thinking about spraying a pasture for weeds, the thing is you can't be like a dog chasing a car. You've heard that old saying, if a dog caught a car, what would he do with it? That's the same way with weed control. If you get weed control, you got to have a plan for what you're going to do with it. If not, you're just sending my kids through college, which makes me happy, but it's really not gaining you anything in the end. So here are a couple of things that you need to think about. One, first and foremost in my mind is you have to be looking to increase the pounds of beef that you produce per acre. All right? To me, that is the basis for any economic model that we come up with, is that pound of beef produced per acre. The other thing is the animal health perspective. I've had any number of people come to me and looking for weed control because they have pink eye, excessive pink eye issues, and they relate that to some of the tall weed species that they get into in midsummer irritating the cattle's eyes. And there can be other things, poisonous plants, and when I say poisonous, I don't necessarily mean you go out there and find the animal dead, but it's an animal that may be lower performance because of the specific weed species that are in that pasture. And the other thing is cheap real estate. Now, what do I mean by that? Folks, the cheapest piece of real estate that you'll ever buy will be the acre of grass that you gain when you implement a good weed control strategy. Right now we're looking at cash rents on pastures going for $60, even up to $100 an acre in certain parts of the country. Sometimes we have to look at our own pastures and say, how many acres can I gain back in forage if I would simply go in and spend $15 to $20 an acre cleaning up the weeds? And sometimes you'll find that that might be a cheaper alternative than going across the fence and renting your neighbor's pasture for $60+ an acre. And then we have the noxious weed control. Noxious weeds, they get loose on our farms, they increase, and then we end up with some real serious issues later on down the road, so kind of heading those off. And the other thing, depending on what part of the country you're from, if you're from Kansas and Nebraska, somebody might knock on your door one day and say, if you don't clean up these musk thistle out in your pasture, we're going to fine you. And then I can't argue with these, but environmental benefits can also be associated with that, and aesthetics. And again, they don't really relate necessarily to dollar value directly, but those can certainly be factors as well. Now, In Gary and Don's book, they have this book, Quotes and Concepts. There's a quote in there that said, "Weeds are thieves." I've taken that a little step farther, and I said, "Weeds are nitrogen thieves." And here is here's a chart that kind of shows different weed species and the amount of nitrogen they actually use. So we look here at Canada thistle. Canada thistle in a vegetative state is about 4.5% nitrogen on a dry matter basis. When it gets into mid-bloom, it's about 2.6, 2.7%. Look at a lot of these common weeds. Here's lamb's quarter, ragweed, curly dock, henbit, redroot pigweed, and Virginia pepperweed. Look at the amount of nitrogen content they have. Now, when we put that next to our cool season grasses, this lower line here are cool season grasses in a mid-bloom stage or in a reproductive stage. This taller line here is the amount of nitrogen we find on a dry matter basis when they're in a vegetative state. Look at how weed species fare with the grass species they're growing with. They're using as much, or in some cases, they're using more of the nitrogen in our field than our own grasses. And this directly relates to the amount of production that we lose. So what is my economic weed threshold? I've given you kind of the basis. It's cheap real estate. It's getting back those acres, but it's also getting back those resources that are going to be needed to push our forage production on forward. So here's just a simple scenario. This is the basis of identifying the economic weed threshold on your farm. If you are looking for weed control, and let's say you're going to spend $20 an acre on weed control. That's with the herbicide, the application fee, $22 an acre. And say the profit per pound of beef that you sell off that farm is 50 cents. If we take $20 and divide that by 50 cents, that tells us that we need 40 pounds of beef to compensate for the amount of herbicide we used on that 1 acre. Okay? That's a minimum. Or another way you can look at that, if I cleaned up my weeds, could I get an extra steer per 20 acres? That would pay for it. Or could I get an extra cow-calf pair per 12.5 acres? That's assuming that we're going to pay for weed control in 1 year. Now imagine, take that back what I said earlier, managing your pastures properly to get 2 and 3 years out of a herbicide application, all right? Now that's 40 pounds of beef over the next 3 years that you need to pay for that herbicide application. Or, you know, a third of a steer per 20 acres or a steer per 60 acres is what you really need. So this is kind of the basis for identifying an economic weed threshold. So here's a few questions you have to ask yourself, and I'm going to give you the answer to a rough estimate for these for your purposes. But what is the average annual forage production on a farm? All right, that's something you need to have in the back of your mind because that's going to be important. If we're trading weeds for biomass, we need to have an estimate of what that's going to be. What is the current profit per acre? Or you could also ask yourself, what is the current profit per pound of beef sold? All right? So those are the questions you have to ask yourself. Now we have to take those questions that you've asked yourself and we have to put some assumptions with them because we're going to try to estimate this economic weed threshold. First off, what does a pound of weeds cost us in a field? All right? Normally we say, and this is based a lot on studies in rangeland, is that a pound of weeds costs us about a pound of forage. In some cases, I've had people argue with me that it's probably a little more than that in some cases, and if we look at that nitrogen chart that I put up earlier, it may be a little higher than that. But let's be conservative with our estimates today and say a pound of weeds cost us a pound of forage, and that's what we're going to gain if we clean it up. What is the feed conversion for your cattle on grass? Now the range that I find in the literature is it can be as little as 7 pounds of dry matter of a good high quality forage can put a pound of gain on an animal, and that can go up to 10 for moderate quality forage. In some cases, Gary and I have talked about this, and I can certainly see that here in Missouri where I live now, is that it might take 15 or 20 pounds because the forage is so poor in these particular pastures. But we're going to shoot for a range of 7 to 10, and for the model I'm going to present, we're going to say it's going to take 10 pounds of grass to put a dry matter, or on a dry matter basis, to put a pound of gain on an animal. I'm going to say 3 years. 2 to 3 years is what I think should be minimum for squeezing a herbicide application out. And then how well do you utilize your forage? Gary talked about this earlier, But if you're in a continuous grazing system, you are not utilizing your forage as well as someone who's in a rotational grazing system. So if you're in a continuous grazing system, you may only be using 25 to 30% of your forage. All right? If you're in a rotational grazing system, we could push that up to 50 or 60%, and some people would suggest even higher than that. And then what is the annual forage production on pastures? In this part of the world, in the transition zone, I think 2 to 6 tons. Given the year, that's a pretty wide range, but we're usually shooting for some mean in there. So now we're going to pull these assumptions together, okay? And what I've done is I've plugged these into an economic model based on these assumptions and try to spit out some values to give you at least some guidelines on where your economic weed threshold actually falls. And so here's what I've come up with. Let's take a look at this. Let's say your current profit is a quarter per pound of beef sold, all right? Some of you are all saying, oh, that's way too low. Let's just go with it for right now. Let's say your profit is 25 cents per pound. Let's say that you're producing somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds of dry matter on your farm a year. And let's say that you're in a continuous grazing system, so somewhere around this 30%. When we look at what weed control can gain us in terms of forage production and how we could break even with that extra forage production, with extra beef production, what this chart tells us is that somewhere between, we'll say 15 to 20% of your total biomass in your field is made up of weeds, that if you were to go out and make an application that based on this data that you plugged in, you should at least break even, all right? Anything over that is going to pay for itself several times over in some cases. Now we move up to the forage utilization, we're up here to 50 or 60%. These numbers are almost cut in half. So those folks that are in a rotational grazing system, when you remove weeds, it's much more impactful than the person who's at that continuous grazing level. All right, it really pays for itself at a much lower level. So this is where we stand at a quarter. Now let's say we're at 50 cents per pound. We're making 50 cents per pound. Let's look at this 6,000 to 8,000 pound range again. Look how the numbers change. They're almost cut in half. All right, so getting control of those weeds puts us in this particular situation that if we get down there to around 10% weed pressure in our field, that we can go in and control weeds. And if we're willing to increase our stocking rate, put another animal out there on 15, 20 acres, that we can at least break even on these particular fields. So this is kind of the basis for the model. I've been working on it now for about 3 years. I'm hoping that sometime in the future that we can release this online and have you be able to come in and plug in your own values. But this is kind of the basis for the model. So with that, I want to show you what people get with good weed control, and then I'm going to take some questions. This is out of Stockton, Missouri. This is the Circle A Ranch. And they went in and made an application with a product called Chaparral this spring. And over here you'll see buckbrush. You'll see there's a lot of aster species over here, and you also see some the brown seed heads on tall fescue. They made an application for weed control and seed head suppression on tall fescue, and this is the spray line they left. The cattle camped out on this side of the field. They never offered to go over there and graze. They had grazed this side of the field much more evenly, and the forage utilization over here was much better. But this, by using these tools, this is what Circle A Ranch got with weed control. I will guarantee you that weed control paid for itself the first year in this particular situation because they had given up, looks like 30 to 40% of their production in that pasture alone. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
We've got a few minutes. I appreciate Scott using his time efficiently. So who has a question for him? Raise your hand. Question back here.
It looks really good. There's got to be some downsides to this. I guess that's a chemical that you put on there.
Right.
You got any downsides?
Any downsides?
Yeah. I mean, what effect does it have on your clovers?
What effect does it have on your clovers? So most of these herbicides are going to take your clovers out. Mm-hmm. Where does these pesticides come, or Herbicide.
Where do you get something like that from?
Oh, this particular herbicide is made by Dow AgroSciences, and you can find that at any co-op. Most co-ops here in the Midwest, I mean here particularly in Missouri, it's MFA sells these herbicides.
I was asking if there's downsides. Any downsides?
Downsides, I mean, as far as there's a loss of clover, but in an extremely weedy field, when you're giving up a lot of your carrying capacity, removal of those clovers are not a bad thing, especially when most of them are going to start coming right back within a year. So it is a small price to pay for getting the carrying capacity up on your farm.
And also, there's exhibitors in the exhibit area that has brochures, and Dow has a booth there, so go by and talk to them. Another question over here.
I was just questioning your economic model a little bit. To me, it seems like you've already made the investment in the business, the cattle, the profit number's got to be a whole lot closer to what they're selling my cattle for than 25 or 50 cents.
Well, that's
Gains above and beyond after you've already made the light switch is already on, you're already running. So
right.
I would think that you could be using $1 a pound or $2 a pound.
I could really fluff up this model. I could really fluff it up and make it look good. But let's say that in 5 years from now, the market collapses again, and we're probably going to be back down there, within the next decade to that level, I would think. I'd much rather for you all to walk out here with a general idea of what weed control is going to look like, even when we're not living in a golden age of beef. So, yeah, you can take those numbers, and in some cases, if you want to say $1 a pound, well, you double those numbers that I have there, and that went from 10% now down to 5%. And it's almost, if you see a weed out there.
I think that's more realistic is all I'm suggesting.
Well, I'm trying to be conservative here, not trying to be the chemical guy trying to shove.
One more quick question for Scott, and he will be around today. He'll be also around the exhibit along with some of his colleagues. Any other questions?
I got one.
Oh, yes.
Yes, sir.
Sorry.
So we tend to group all broadleaf plants that we didn't plant in the pasture as weeds. Are there some weeds that may have some nutritional value for livestock?
That's a good question. The question is, are there weeds out there that have nutritional value to livestock? Common ragweed is one that animals will graze on quite heavily in the springtime, and that's fine. But my problem is that when you get to midsummer, those ragweeds are taking up a lot of valuable real estate in our pasture that could be, producing grass. And so we've got a good flush of grass in the spring, and I don't know if the ragweed is really that necessary, even though the cattle eat it. So when you get later into the summer, by not getting control of those ragweeds in the spring, we've probably decreased total seasonal production just because of the pressure they're putting on our pasture in the fall. So some broadleaves are, yes, they are beneficial, but in the case of common ragweed, it's something that really decreases our yearly production. And we get into this conversation a lot of times. I have people point blank tell me, they say, well, my cattle will eat that particular weed. Well, there's a great story by Jerry Clowers. He said he has a meeting with his friend who had a coon dog. And he said, what do you feed your coon dog? And he said, I feed my coon dog turnip greens. He goes, what do you feed yours? He said, I feed it dog food. He said, because I don't think my dog would eat turnip greens. And he goes, well, mine wouldn't for a month. We put our cattle in positions a lot of times to graze certain species out there that they probably don't want to graze, is what I'm trying to say.
Let's give Scott a big round of applause. He did a great job, and he also kept us on time. So thank you so much, Scott.